rather go for a speciation event with introgression of archaic hominins gene within Africa, or a multi-regional that Christian say, don't say multi-regional because of course it does not like that, but I mean we may say multi-regional origin of modern humans in Africa. What we see in Africa, in fact, fit quite well with now the overwhelming evidence showing that there was a systematic gene exchange between archaic hominin like Denisova and Neanderthal with modern humans. And the last paper even suggests that this exchange may have started quite soon, at around 250,000 years ago. And some of this exchange, as some author has argued, even left phenotypic modification on Eurasian modern humans that are detectable by analyzing the origin of a skull. So the idea that is now, I mean, let's say widely accepted, but accepted by many, is stemming from a meeting that we had 4 years ago at Oxford, in which we have promoted the idea of a evolution of modern human in structural population in Africa that have led to this paper in Trending Ecology Evolution and subsequent paper written by the organizer of this meeting, Eleanor Sherry. According to this model, climate change have, let's say, open or close contact in human population, sometimes favoring and sometimes preventing gene exchange, but also cultural exchange within the African continent. Okay, from an archaeological point of view, it is true that now we see what it was almost unknown 20 years ago, many cultural innovation in Africa that was only partially known. So we have many sites with use of ochre. We have very complex lithic technology. I don't know whether there is a pointer here. Oh, perhaps, I mean, doesn't really. You have your own.
Yes.
Can I borrow it?
Yes, absolutely. It's the first.
That's very kind of you. Okay, so we have a complex lithic technology, hafting techniques, fully shaped bone tool, which was something that was believed to start only at the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic, abstract engravings on ochre, on ostrich eggshell, even drawing on stone, complex treatment of pigment. But these innovation, in fact, are at present only restricted to 2 areas in Africa, perhaps partially because of lack of research in some area. But it's still, I mean, it's quite clear that within Africa, there are many regions in which this does not occur. And also, they do not appear to arrive as a revolution, clearly immediately stemming from a biological event. The first innovation to come out is use of mineral pigments. There are sites that are around 500,000 and 300,000 years ago. And then bone tool, bead engravings, shaped, but it's something, this innovation occur over a very, very large period of time. And we see in parallel, many of these innovations also spreading outside Africa, well before the arrival of modern humans in Africa. I mean, the earliest occurrences of pigment in Europe is almost 400,000 years ago at Ramata, where we have many pieces of ochre modified to produce powder. We have also very early in time in Italy and Germany the use of complex masting, hafting technique with mastic heated from birch bark. We have the use of pigment to cover objects. We have many burials in the Near East. There are many more burials in the Near East and in Europe, primary burial, than burial in Africa. And recently, quite interesting evidence coming out showing that many of the innovations that we find in Africa are also present in the Neanderthal world and outside the Neanderthal world in Eurasia. Some of these more striking innovation, with the construction of, the breaking 4 tons of speleothem, stalagmite, to create a circular structure inside cave, like it's a Bruniquel, 176,000 years ago. Now the newly published Megaloceros phalange from Germany, with many incisions that cannot be interpreted in no way as cut marks. This is something I worked on, the deeply engraved cross-crash pattern from the Gorham's Cave at Gibraltar. The presence at some Spanish site of pigment. So I personally work on this site, and we show that this pigment was not natural. It's not a painting, but it's clearly an ochre that was applied by hand on this large stalagmitic dome. And now the newly published La Roche-Cotard finger fluting on this site that apparently is 67,000 years old. And even if we take apart the controversial site of Rising Star, there are clear evidence of mortuary practice well before the advent of primary burial in Africa and in Europe. For example, I mean, for the moment, no natural hypothesis have been able to account for the presence of many individuals at the Cima de los Huesos. So, and with the arrival of more and more paper describing chimps' mortuary practices, or at least an attention for the dead body, we may think that we are missing 8 million years of mortuary practices in the archaeological record. So this was just a slide to present. We have very few evidence of primary burial. The Pangaea Saidi that we published a few years ago, and the oldest Pangaea Saidi, and the infant burial from Border Cave, to which it was associated with personal ornament. So the first synthesis of this picture is that if we look at the overall record about innovation between, let's say, 500,000 years ago and 20,000 years ago, the empirical evidence contradicts the hypothesis of an origin of modern human cognition produced by the sudden or gradual emergence of a cultural package due to a biological event. We observe instead a heterogenic, multi-origin, asynchronous pattern with no single epicenter in Africa, and encompassing fossil species other than Homo sapiens in Africa. The temporal pattern of cultural change is more complex than what we would expect with a gradual incremental accumulation. And rather than accumulation, we find multiple asynchronous and unstable regional trajectories. We also observe a gradual decoupling after 300,000 years ago in the relationship between morphology and cognition, indicating that the main driver becomes cultural niche construction rather than natural selection, which does not mean that natural selection was not at work. And in this context, we must accept the idea that it is material culture and brain plasticity that shapes, after 300,000 years ago, cognition, and not the opposite. So this was an argument that we already put forward in a string of paper with my colleague Ivan Collaget, in which we create a database with innovation, not just symbolic, but also linked to technology, subsistence, and observe that this innovation, in fact, do not seem to identify any point in time in which a biological event would produce a dramatic change in the race of innovation. And we reached the conclusion that cultural innovation were triggered by several interconnected and dynamic factors, both environmental and social, and they are the outcome of complex and non-linear population dynamics and cultural trajectories. They need to be understood and traced at a regional scale. So in this paper, we propose that a triad of 3 elements would allow the emergence of innovation, but then we see that there are other papers and by other authors that I will mention later. So we said, well, we may envision the emergence of innovation and of course the creativity with three elements. One is cultural exaptation, the other is social learning, or teaching if you want in a more general terms, and cultural neural reuse. So I won't go into what cultural neural reuse is. I would say it's just brain plasticity that allow individuals submitted to intense teaching to modify the networking in their brain and even the anatomy of their brain during their lifetime. The social learning, I mean, I would guess that you know what social learning means, and cultural exaptation is a term, I would say, we may even say a metaphor from the biological exaptation, is the term that was created by Stephen Jay Gould and Elizabeth Verba, in which they say is a character previously shaped by natural selection for a particular function or an adaptation. It is co-opted for a new use, or a character, also called the Spandler, whose origin cannot be ascribed to a direct action of natural selection, and this is co-opted for a current use. So a cultural exaptation would be cases in which an innovation, in fact, is exapted for a new function. Just to give an example of a cultural exaptation. So we have worked quite intensively on the pigment used by the Ovaimba in the northern Namibia, and we have shown with in vitro and in vivo experiment that the ochre that these ladies use protects you from insects, protect you from the sun, but of course also play a key role in their symbolic thinking and the way in which they culturalize their body. So we may imagine a case in which pigment was first used 300,000 years ago to protect the body from ultraviolet radiation, particularly for population with relatively white skin moving to equator, in which we know that ultraviolet radiation are more intense. So this population would be submitted to a selective pressure. So in this case, the first use of pigment will be only functional, and then more different function would come out with the use of pigment to identify social roles or ethnic groups, linguistic groups, and so on. And another acceptation would be when we see this in the Middle Stone Age, when shells are covered, sometimes completely covered with pigment. So this would be a third acceptation. In fact, the first function, which is protecting from the sun, is totally lost, and only the symbolic function survive. Okay, but these three factors, neural reuse, cultural exaptation, and social learning, needs certainly unpacking, and this is what I'm trying to do in the second part of my talk. So we talk a lot about teaching, social learning, but in fact, this concept, social learning, can be declined in many different types. Okay, so this is what we tried to do some years ago with William Banks by creating a grid, if you want, or a theoretical framework to try and understand in a spatial dimension, temporal dimension, social dimension, the many different ways in which information can be acquired by a learner. So we have, for example, in the spatial dimension, you can learn from, and so our idea was to create a grid that could be applied to the archaeological record, and so in a way that would allow us to explore how, and perhaps there was shift or tipping point, we have to use the word tipping point in this GPR, in modification of the cultural transmission. For example, in the spatial dimension, you can learn from distant observation, disconnected proximate observation, conscious observation. So all these, I mean, I could go through it and give you the definition of each of these cases. While in the temporal dimension, you can learn from a single information transfer or repetitive single information transfer and so on. So we, at present, in the framework of a long-term process, we try to apply this grid to 103 cultural traits that have emerged in the human, you may say, our lineage history during the last 3 million years, and try to see what are the, by try to combine, you know, information coming from ethnoarchaeology, experimental archaeology, and so on, what are the minimum requirements for these cultural traits to be transmitted to new generation. Another way to tackle this issue is to try to understand how climate change may have shaped cultural trajectories at the regional scale. This could be done by conceiving quasi-cultural adaptation as a niche, as an ecological niche, and apply to them the tool that they've created by ecologists to study how a niche of a species change when submitted to a climate change. So we may, and this is something that could be done, and we have done several times. So we use predictive algorithms. They take into account climate models with many raster J layers and the location of dated or culturally attributed archaeological site. And using this method, for example, we were able to show that the shift between the Steel Bay, a culture, a human culture of South Africa, and the following Oyson's port, there was a significant niche expansion. So the Steel Bay is just a coastal adaptation. And so we were able to, using two different algorithms, that there was a significant expansion toward inland in a period, and this in spite of climatic deterioration. And we use the same, for example, to study the niche, the cultural niche of Neanderthal at the transition between isotope stage 5, so the last interglacial, and the climatic deterioration of the isotope stage 4. And we showed that Neanderthal managed quite well to keep their territory compared to the predicted niche projection from the isotope stage 5 to 4. So if it were just a maintenance of the niche, Neanderthal would have decreased largely their territory, while in fact, probably with cultural innovation, they were able to cope with the climate change. Okay, and something that we do not also have to forget is that the idea that everything in the revolution theoretical framework that have convinced us that everything new was happening at the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic has pushed us to think that the Upper Paleolithic is just a complete package and there was no changes within the Upper Paleolithic. But in fact, this process of very long-term niche construction is something that go on in the Upper Paleolithic and even in the Neolithic. So we are, and this is, so I mean, give this as an example. Of course, very often people look, for example, in their own work. So in fact, our work on the evolution of sewing technique, and particularly on the needles, we have created a very large database with Luc Doyon covering Eurasia and even North America, showed that the first needle that occurred in 4,000 years ago in Siberia and China are quite different from those of the Upper Paleolithic. And there is a continuous refinement in the morphology, size of needle that become more and more adapted to, for example, for embroidery and not just sewing clothes. Okay, now I will mention other work that, in my view, go in the same direction, but I think they add significantly to what we have proposed so far in our papers. Of course, I start from prehistory in a sense. This is it was already a paper that is relatively old, but it's clear that demography, connection between population, and rate of reproduction also played a role in the emergence and spread and maintenance of cultural innovation. This was already proposed with modeling technique, based on genomic technique, but again, highlight by paper by Jo Heinrich, and is a good archaeological example is the loss of cultural innovation happening in Tasmania. Tasmania up to the Holocene was connected to Australia, and population had very quite complex cultural adaptation. Then they lost them when Tasmania became an island So when English arrived there at the beginning of the 19th century, they found people living in with a relatively poor material culture. But when the archaeologists arrived and did the excavation, they discovered that 30,000 years before, in fact, it was a very complex material. Okay, but other paper went in depth in this issue, for example, in a paper by Maxime Derex and colleagues, in which they show that not any kind of connectivities, in fact, played a role in the maintenance of cultural innovation. That a too strong connectivity, in fact, may prevent cultural innovation to spread. And the best is to have an intermediate level of fragmentation in order to do not, let's say, make an innovation becoming widespread, perhaps before reaching its last and best fitting outcome. Other papers, for example, an interesting paper by the Marcus Feldman team has tried to model the way in which different types of cultural innovation may have been lost by climate change. So basically, they have found that if you have a cultural innovation that in fact is relatively insensitive to ecological change, this innovation would be simpler, but there were more chances that it would be maintained in spite of a climate change. While if you have something that is very specialized for the exploitation, for example, of a particular resource, there are a lot of chances that with a very rapid and continuous climate change, you will lose this innovation. And it may take quite long to recover the same innovation or recover it in a different form. So I think this is a very interesting. There was also work done by Michel Gelfand in which they try to do a cross-cultural analysis of aptitude for creativity in human culture. So they try to understand, so they discovered or identified different degree of creativity in human culture, and they try to understand why the people were more open. So they say it's mostly the climatic setting, which is maybe more or less constrained, that in fact push people to be more or less tolerant to innovation, and also the history of this culture. So in fact, the challenges that human culture had in the past that push parents, because it's something that is incorporated in the children's mind since they are very, very young, to become less or more tolerant toward innovation. So they say there are tight and loose society. The loose society are those that apparently are more open to allow innovation and experimentation to create. In a very interesting paper that just come out, Enrich and Matuszkiewicz have moved to the last step, I would say, in this process. They in fact denied, in a sense, the possibility, I mean, the interest of individual creativity, and say basically all creativity in human come from collective intelligence and shared cognition. So they say innovation in cumulative culture depend on the size, which is something that we already, I mean, it's been said several times in a number of papers, interconnectedness and diversity of a population network's collective brain, that the individual smartness is product of cumulative cultural evolution and thus on collective brain. So in a sense, they deny the role of the individual smartness in the process, in creativity. And also say the problem-solving abilities of groups depend heavily on their cognitive diversity and social psychology, as well as a wide range of interactional, organizational, and epistemological norms. So the culturally evolved norms that govern the interaction among individuals and subgroups, as well as the selection of leaders. So the leaders, which the leaders are seen as those that help this collective intelligence to be more creative. So for them, the creativity, I mean, innovations come out from three different processes. The serendipity, as you know, is the discovery by chance, the creation discovered by chance. Recombination, which in a sense is another way to present cultural exaptation, in a sense, but not necessarily as we will see, and the incremental improvement. And the rates of innovation for them are influenced by sociality, transmission fidelity, cultural variance, with various forces affecting this factor. A very interesting other paper that has come out almost at the same time, and I think that this paper, there are many connections between this paper, is a new paper by Derex, in which he distinguished, or he tried to unpack the cultural evolution, the evolution of, cumulative cultural evolution. And he says, okay, in fact, cumulative culture, there are two types of cumulative culture evolution. One is the type, what they call the type 1. So the type 1 only optimize cultural traits, while the type 2 expand the set of culture or natural phenomena we exploit. As an example, for example, a spear that you would use in a throwing or thrusting motion could lead to a spear thrower. But he points out that this won't necessarily go to a bow and arrow techniques, because in this case, so the bow and arrow technique is not an exaptation of a spear thrower, we have to agree. So in a sense, our concept of exaptation that you presented with Ivan does not account for this type of change in which you exploit the elasticity of a string to create a new technology. So for him, in fact, the cumulative culture evolution would be a combination of a type 1. So a type 1 would just increase the quality of a cultural trait, but it would live in any case at a limit, while may have a type 2 which expand on that, and either it correspond to a dramatic increase with no cost, or with an increase with a cost, because of course in order to move to this type 2 culture innovation, you would need also to experiment. So there will be a cost in moving to another type of, and so the differences between these two types is that the type 1 cannot go on forever. So there will be a moment in which you will reach the maximum potential of that. While the type 2, this potentially generate a continuous improvement because we are crossing natural property coming from different domains. This will create combinatorial opportunities. It will drive up cultural diversity in the long run, because we see the more physical principle you will put together, the more you will establish phylogenies with innovation happening not in the same way in different populations, and stimulate the creation of complex symbolic practices and the ensuing consequences on brain networks, and will stimulate collaborative networks. And I found that this framework, I mean, both papers applied quite well with a evolutionary framework that I tried to I published in a recent paper in Journal of Human Evolution, in which I proposed that there are a multi-step evolutionary process for the evolution of the body, the culturalization of the human body. So for those who are not interested in beads, I would just summarize in 2 slides what happened and say, until 20,000 years ago, it was believed that the first personal ornaments were coming out in Europe with the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic, while now we know that personal ornaments are already used in Africa 140,000 years ago in Morocco and in many other different sites. And now we have more and more information to understand how this behavior changed through time. So we have come, I came out with the idea that we can identify different steps in the evolution of the body culturalization, The first would coincide with the emergence of e-pigment in human history, 300 or perhaps 500,000 years ago. And now we have proof that the number of pigment increased slowly during the Mid-Stone Age. Okay, in fact, this use of pigment coincide in a sense with the step one framework proposed by Derek, but not necessarily, because we know that at least 120,000 years ago, pigment was heat treated to change the color. So in fact, already within pigment, we may face a type 2 cumulative cultural evolution. And then we move to step by step, sometime to type 1, sometime to type 2. For example, later on, we have just the single curation of shells, perhaps used as personal ornament. Then we have the perforation of shells. And then at some stage, we have the fully shaped shell. So in fact, we are applying a new type of physical property of the abrasion in order to shape shells, morphology that do not exist in nature. And I mean, I won't go into detail up to we moved with many different type of beads, sometimes shapes, sometimes fossil shells, marine shells, etc. And I propose in this paper that this is just the archaeological tip of an iceberg of other type of modifications that do not leave any trace in the archaeological record, like tattooing, scarification, ritual mutilation, and so on. So we would, in fact, our body would be the receptacle of a number of type 1 and type 2 innovation. And this fit quite well also with the paper that we try to publish, and is a result of a collaboration with the neuroscientists from the Neuro campus here in Bordeaux. So we have designed an fMRI study in which we try to identify the area of the brain that are solicited when people attribute a social status to culturalized faces. And the work showed that there are many different areas of the brain, both linked to the executive control and the social cognition, that we connect when we attribute a social status to somebody. This may well be the consequence, the last consequence of a very long process in which the code of our body culturalization has become more and more complex to cope with more complex technologies to identify the social status of people within society. So I think it's interesting because, in a sense, here what we call the neural reuse and genetic evolution coincide. So basically, our brain has been selected slowly for those adaptations. So this is something that happened at the level of individual as soon as this code became more complex, but at the time it has been probably selected to create this complex network, and perhaps in the past, 100,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago, we don't have access to those brains. This network was less complex than we see at present. So my conclusion, I don't know whether I've taken too much time. My conclusion is that typically human creativity is not the result of the sudden emergence of a race of innovators, but the emergence of innovation is better explained as the result of a process of niche construction over a long period of time, influenced by demography, cultural connection, climate change, shifting cumulative cultural evolution types, cultural exaptation, a new mode of cultural transmission that have exploited the brain plasticity typical of the member of our genius. And I will end with this slide, and I hope that I convince you that we have to do the opposite of what the chief of these companies tell the guy. He say, you get back to that goddamn cubicle and start thinking outside the box. In fact, in order to think outside the box, you have to do the opposite. If we want to save our planet, we have to promote connection between brain, we have to promote collective intelligence and share cognition. And it's very difficult to be creative if you go back to your box and try to think out of the box. Thank you.